Let's see. Wow, that's a lot bigger than I thought. Check, check. Make sure my mic is working well. Okay, okay. There's New York City right there. Okay, so today on the stream, this is my first stream. I actually did one a while ago, but it didn't really work very well. I couldn't get the audio set up, but this is my first official stream. And I want to talk about a class that I've been taking here, and it's about Carl Jung. And Carl Jung is a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. They actually worked together, but they ended up breaking off somewhere along the line. And the main reason why they broke off was because of their view of the unconscious, which we'll get into. And it relates to religion. And religion ended up being a part of their theory that they couldn't agree on. So their ultimate goal at the beginning of everything was to come up with a unified theory of human development. So starting all the way as a little child, human development, all the way to the development of psychopathology, stuff like that. They're trying to develop this unified theory together. And it was actually a cluster of different people. So like a huge goal, that would have been like a major milestone in science in general. And, I think we can all agree that they didn't really quite get it done. And so we can start at the beginning and focus really in on the unconscious. And this is really where the disagreement begins. So Sigmund Freud's view of the unconscious is that it was very, very primitive. He saw it as the primitive mind, like the mind of an ape, essentially, and that it was hyper erotic and sexualized and all about sexual desire. And Jung could not get on board with that, and as we'll discuss. So first I want to talk about Sigmund Freud's own theory and why he developed that theory in the first place, because he's right in a lot of ways, but Jung ultimately disagrees with him and has a base for disagreeing with him on that kind of stuff. So we have the unconscious mind. Okay, computer's going crazy. Okay, so we have the unconscious mind, and obviously we got to figure out where did it even come from. We have the unconscious and the conscious. We've all seen like the kind of psychological iceberg where the ego and the conscious mind sits on top of the unconscious mind. That's kind of hidden beneath the waves. Don't really see it all that often. And the question comes, how did this unconscious and conscious mind, this duality, how did it even form? And so Sigmund Freud's view is that the unconscious is the primitive brain, and the conscious arose out of that. The conscious is way more logical, way more rational, and therefore has like a better aptitude for science. And we see the science is emphasized in this time because we are conscious. And that was his theory. And so that's his theory about how those parts kind of function, but how they develop. And this is where it gets really crazy. So long time ago in human history, we have the first ancestors of humanity. We have these apes that are still in the trees, but they're starting to come down from the trees. We have a climate disaster that reduces the amount of trees, the rainforests in Africa to like a little tiny chunk, relative to what they were. And we have the savannas. The savanna environment is now kind of taking over the rainforest environment that was the rainforest environment. And because of that, the human animal, or the ancestors of the human animal, have to make a shift. And the shift occurs when they move down to the ground. They're now in a different environment, much more vulnerable. They have to adapt. They have to learn to work together. But one of the biggest things that had to happen was that our male ancestors needed to have a reason to stay around the female ancestors. And this part just blows my mind. The mechanism for that, based on these theories, is that the women, or you can call it female, I think they're like Austriopleistines or something, they started to lose the they started to lack estrus, which is going into heat. And so instead of going into heat, which would narrow the mating season to a certain time period, they lost that function. And what that meant was mating season is now 24/7. And that's how it is still for humans, you could say, mating season. And so what that did, and this is where Sigmund Freud's theory, in my opinion, shines through. What that did is made everything erotic. And now erotic doesn't necessarily have to mean sexual. Erotic is just like this tension, I guess, kind of like this energy. Another word that is oftentimes used is like libido. It just, the best way to understand it, I think, is through examples. And so instead of a woman or a female in the group or a male in the group just being another group member, they have a different level of significance because that person is your partner. And your spear, for example, that you use to go and kill animals is not just a spear. It's not just a tool anymore. It's now a tool that you use to, save your family, or a tool that you use to gather the food and resources necessary to have a family. Everything takes on additional meaning, and this is animism. So in an animistic culture, animistic perspective, from that perspective, everything has life. Everything has an additional layer of meaning that isn't really there when you look at it. Like I have a water bottle here. The water bottle is a water bottle, but it's more than that. It's something I've taken around with me all across the country, really. And so it has a little bit more significance than just a water bottle. And so that is kind of an animistic perspective toward my water bottle. And so this is the first point of the conscious mind coming out of the unconscious iceberg. And the unconscious iceberg that's below the water. The first little point in its animism. And as Sigmund Freud suggested, and I mentioned this previously before, is that he had all these crazy theories, these like sexual developmental theories that were, looking back at them today, like this is absolutely bizarre. But he has a point in that the depths of our psyche, the depths of our understanding of the world, the way that we look at the world, is inherently very sexual in nature. And so he took it to the logical conclusion, which was that every single thing that we do is just to fulfill a desire. It's just a sexual desire. And obviously, I think that's false. But you can see how his theory rings true in the fact that it is always mating season. We're always kind of expected to look a certain way and behave a certain way and have manners, which isn't observed in other organisms, even the ones that are closely related to us. They don't have those same kind of things. And you can argue, perhaps, that certain like sociological or societal standards also come out of that, like moral behavior. Why should I act moral, or why should I behave in a certain way? Because of the need to fit in, and the need to fit in is really based on this need to have a partner in the end. Okay, so very fascinating as far as Sigmund Freud. And so this led Sigmund Freud to really devalue the unconscious mind. He looked at it as something that was primitive, something that was just like hypersexualized. And that's why his theories, again, are just bizarre and very degrading to humanity by saying, like the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. It's looking at the human animal and being like, we're just an animal, right? And it makes sense because the people who influence him, or one of the people that influenced him so much, was Darwin. And Sigmund Freud is often credited for taking Darwin's perspective to the logical conclusion and applying it to psychology. And so I think we can get a different appreciation for Freud by looking at him through this lens. Another thing we can realize is that Freud was right in a way that he didn't even know. And so he says these things, and we'll have to get into them later, but the Oedipus complex, if anybody's familiar with it, we get in these things like the Oedipus complex, and they sound insane, which, to the regular human, like they're absolutely bizarre. But when you look at it through a mythological perspective, as we'll have to get into in a different video, you see that there is like a little layer of truth in there that I'm not even sure Sigmund Freud knew that he was communicating. It was just insane. Okay, but let's back up a little bit. We have the unconscious mind. Freud is arguing, this is just primitive. It's just inherently sexual, and it's really kind of degrading. As far it's like the part of the human animal that we don't want to know about, and so we store it away. And then this is where Carl Jung comes in, and he's like, I can't see the unconscious as that. He recognizes, yes, that the unconscious has the shadow, that it does have some negative aspects, and that kind of holds those negative aspects of humanity. But he also looked at the unconscious as a product of some of our most impressive cognitive abilities, like our imagination or our ability to create, our ability to innovate, and as we'll get into, our ability to have these religious experiences. And so Freud sees it as, again, we should be pushing this down. This is not what we need to do. This is not what we need to look at. Jung is like, no, this is actually a mixture of the best parts of humanity and the worst parts of humanity. But it's a mixture of those two, and the ego is kind of in the middle, which is crazy. And so I think another interesting way to look at it is through this perspective of masculine and feminine. And so we all know like the terms masculine and feminine and kind of what they entail. But we're going to expand on those terms, and we'll see that they mean a lot more than just, masculine represents strength or feminine represents emotion or something like that. They go way, way deeper. And so what I've been learning in class is that when you look at the masculine, we have a bunch of different characteristics. We have like strength, I mentioned before. We have innovation. We have a focus on logic and rationality and reason, all these things. Then we look at the feminine, we have more of an emphasis on emotion, but we also have this idea of stability and oneness with nature, which are all extremely important. And so when we can look back at the earliest societies. There's a city, it's called Katal Hayuk, and it's the earliest, I think it's the earliest or one of the earliest cities that they've discovered, and they have like a pretty good idea of the layout of the city, everything. And it's fascinating how these, we'll get into it, how all these kind of connect. And so at the center of their city, they had this temple, and the temple, it was actually run by essentially a goddess, or like the representation of a goddess in human form. So there's a woman there who was the head of the church essentially. And the priests in this society, they were male, but they were all eunuchs. And so the idea here is that the society, just looking at the religious structure, we would expect that the society would be more in touch with the feminine. And what would we look for if the society was more in touch with the feminine? We would see more stability. We would see a better relationship to nature. And when we look at this society, that's exactly what we see. It's a society that existed, a city that existed essentially unchanged for 2,000 years, which is just insane when you think about modern day cities. Like look at Europe. What areas of Europe have stayed relatively the same for 2,000 years? And so it's pretty incredible to think that a city could be stable, could be that stable for that long, and that it's potentially because of the emphasis of more feminine features, okay, of reality. So this is where things get so confusing, and I hope that people can understand this, because it took me a while to understand it over the course of these lectures. So the feminine not only represents these characteristics that I've spoken about, but they represent a part of us. So we all know that every person has a mixture of both of these things. Like nobody is completely devoid of emotions. Like we all have emotions. We all have feminine. And obviously anybody can be reasonable, logical, rational. So we both men and women have a mixture of masculine and feminine. And so when we look at these things, we shouldn't look at them as male and female. We look at them as a set of characteristics. Okay, and then these characteristics can then be placed and kind of applied it to our own psyche. And this is where it gets so crazy. When we think of the more stable aspect of our brain, you know, the more stable one, the more natural one, you could say natural, the older one, the one that kind of creates everything else, you should be thinking the unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind is there, it's stable, it's something that we don't really interact with very much. And so that'll have implications as well, as the unconscious mind is something that we've kind of suppressed. The ego is something that we have super heavily focused on. And this is why we can live in massive cities. This is why we can develop medicines and stuff like that. It's because we're focusing on the ego, and the ego is masculine in nature, which is science, it's innovation, it's logic, it's rationality, all these things, which produce giant cities, which produce, brilliant minds, which produce philosophers and all this stuff and different medical treatments, for example. And so it has a benefit. But focusing more on the unconscious mind would then result in a more stable society that has a better connection, I would say, like a better integration into itself, and then a better connection to the surrounding, just nature in general. And so when we look, going back to Sigmund Freud, what we see is Freud interpreting things in a way that's almost purely masculine. He's looking at things as like either he discarded the feminine, essentially. We see it's either you're masculine or you're non-masculine. Like there wasn't even a feminine really in his worldview. And I think that's why a lot of people don't like him. And I understand that. And I disagree with Freud on that. And that's where Carl Jung comes in. But I do want to mention, like, I've had professors in the past that, like, we would talk about Sigmund Freud. It'd be like one sentence that we would learn about him in class, and they would really bash on him. It'd be like, if Sigmund Freud was alive today, he'd blame all these problems on me. And it's mainly from like the women that were professors. And it seemed like the men that were professors kind of gravitated towards Sigmund Freud a little bit. I think that's interesting. But so we have Freud really throwing away the feminine, being like, it's not really that relevant. And so when we have to divide, like, is he right? Or is he just inventing and just making this up off the cuff? So I would say that he's right in the sense that femininity in our societies has decreased. Is he right to say that masculinity is more important? No. But I think he's right in the fact that the tables have kind of turned to emphasize masculinity. And again, the masculine, we have the ego, we have consciousness, we have innovation, and that's what we have in the world today. Okay, so Carl Jung, he looks at this and he's like, he disagrees basically. He's like, no, there is an element of femininity. There is that feminine goddess that's inside everybody that we need to be in touch with. And that's really the big break for these two. And Carl Jung goes on his way to look at so many different things and really take a deep dive into this unconscious mind that, again, is that feminine. He's really researching and looking into the more feminine aspects of our nature. And so I don't know if y'all are ready for this, but we'll jump to it. Talk a little bit about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is probably not the first, but the earliest written story that we have. And it's myth, so it's mythological. And so the theory from guys like Freud and Jung is that what we're looking at is the origins of consciousness when we read something like Gilgamesh. We're looking at how the ego, the masculine, the id, you could say, the unconscious, the feminine, how they relate to each other and how they interact. And so this is just absolutely mind-blowing. We're introduced to this character, Gilgamesh, right at the beginning, and he's this hyper masculine, like, demigod. He's part god, he's part king, absolute beast. He's like 18 feet tall, right? When everybody else is a normal person. And he lives in a kingdom, right? He's got everything. And immediately we're introduced to a ton of turmoil in the society that he lives in. Everybody is like looking at Gilgamesh like, this ain't right. Like, we shouldn't have this hyper masculine guy running the entire place. Like, this is too much. And one of the things that they really were upset with was that he had the first like marriage, he had the first bed right to all the newlywed couples. And so he would get to sleep with the wife of everybody so that the offspring would be more like him. And so just from this, right, we have to discard this idea that this is supposed to be history. Like, this is about a real king. And it's not. There was no real king named Gilgamesh. Now, maybe it was based off of an individual, but he wasn't literally 18 feet tall, you know? And I think the same can be said about characters like Jesus, which is for a different time, different video, okay? We'll get to that eventually. Okay, so where was I? We have Gilgamesh, we have him basically monopolizing the connection to the feminine in his society. And he's basically saying there's only one way that we're going to relate masculine and feminine. It's through me. It's through this super hyper masculine guy. And so what we can take away from that, remember, we have to think about these things in like 3 different dimensions, which makes it so difficult. But we look at it, we go, okay, if Gilgamesh, right, we know that he's hyper masculine, we know that he's representing the ego, the conscious mind, the rational mind, the thinking mind, the logical mind. We know that these women are more feminine, right? They're described oftentimes as like being very beautiful. You know, their feminine features are more emphasized. They're representing the unconscious mind. And so he is saying that how we are going to modulate the unconscious mind is purely through the ego. So, okay, just mind-blowing, which is this is exactly how we exist today. The unconscious mind is like boiling underneath, really technically kind of running the show. But the way we experience it is completely through the ego. It's like the only way we're going to relate to the unconscious feminine mind that we have is through the ego. And that's exactly how we exist today. And so just crazy. Okay. So we're only at the beginning of the story. It gets wild. So we have a bunch of turmoil. The individuals actually cry out to the gods, to the great goddess. And I think of the imagery there, right? Going back, crying out to the depths of our nature, being like, we need to solve this problem. And what does she do? She creates Enkidu. And Enkidu is described as being covered from head to toe in fur. He's got like hooved feet. He's a monster, basically. He's also huge. And he, at first, is like sent to basically distract and change Gilgamesh. And so we have this very primitive creature in Enkidu. So what does he represent? Again, he's masculine, you could say, but he's also very wild, very primitive, and very in touch with nature. And so he kind of represents a mixture of both. There's descriptions of him in the text where he is hanging out in fields of animals, just like eating with the animals. He essentially is an animal for a while. And so the idea here is that the great goddesses are sending Enkidu to help Gilgamesh get more in touch with his feminine, more natural side, which is unconscious brain. Okay, so we got this going, and there's a scene where Enkidu is actually protecting the first wife of, or the bride of somebody on their wedding night, where he's got his foot against the door, not letting Gilgamesh in. So think about the imagery there, where it's like, no, we're gonna relate to the feminine in a different way, and it's not like this. So Enkidu is stepping in to prevent that. again, it's like the meaning is just on different dimensions. It's wild. Okay, so he's serving this purpose, Enkidu, and they fight. And Gilgamesh eventually wins, and Enkidu kind of concedes. So we have more important stuff right there. We see that this wild, more natural, more feminine figure is defeated by Gilgamesh, the more rational, logical, important one. Okay. And what happens immediately after this? They go to kill Humbaba. Humbaba is a spirit of the forest. And he's ancient spirit of the forest. He's like a monster, basically. So what does Humbaba represent? And why do they have to kill him? So this is where it just gets, I'm going to say this 100 times, it gets crazier because it all gets crazier every time. So we have Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they're now buddies, right? But Enkidu is clearly below Gilgamesh. And what do they have to do? Immediately, there's like nothing really even happens. They're like bored, and then we're like, okay, we have to go in the forest. We have to kill Humbaba. Like, this is the plan. Why? Humbaba represents another element of the unconscious, basically saying we need to like kill and completely get rid of this way of thinking, of this way of relating to our environment. We have to completely get rid of it and replace it with the relationship that you and I have, where the ego is, as Gilgamesh, is now above and supreme against the feminine, unconscious id. Okay, so we have Enkidu, we have Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is on top now. Enkidu's like this. Before, right, they were kind of equal. They're fighting. Boom. And now they're like, we have to throw away this part. We have to go kill Humbaba. He represents ancient spirits, essentially, like an ancient spirit of humanity. And he's killed. And so my professor, brilliant guy, his theory is that our minds will never be affected, be impacted by Humbaba ever again. That there's a certain element of us that has kind of been discarded and replaced by Gilgamesh. Okay, this is where it just gets more and more crazy every time. So kill Humbaba, boom, cut down this tree, which again, like Jung has a book about trees, and one of the big things is that the tree is like the perfect representation of this idea of divinity, where you have the roots of the tree they're rooted in the earth, in the ground, but you have this big thing that shoots up in the air, and then you have heaven kind of on top of the tree. Okay, so we're getting off track a little bit. This gets crazy, but you see that we cut this down and we turn it into like a boat, and we come back. Also, we chop Humbaba's head off, which has significance. Okay, but we have to get into that different time. So we do all this. We come back to civilization, and what's the first thing that happens? The gods are upset again. They're like, we brought Enkidu here to solve a problem, to help Gilgamesh relate to the feminine in a different way, and it didn't work. So what do the goddesses do? They're like, yo, we're going to send the bull, like it's a giant bull from heaven, from space. We're going to send it and try and kill Gilgamesh once and for all. And the bull is an immensely important figure. It's like the religious figure that we were talking about before of Katal Hayuk. And so very religious significance here with the bull. And what we've learned is that the bull represents femininity, like the essence of femininity. It's another representation of the Great Mother. So the gods send the bull, and this is like, right, this should be the climax of the story. This should be like an awesome, drawn out fight. And what happens? Gilgamesh and Enkidu handle it in like 3 seconds. Basically, Enkidu grabs its tail, boom, and then Gilgamesh cuts its head off and actually ends up cutting off its phallus and throwing it at the goddesses. And think about like the imagery behind that is where Gilgamesh is basically just flipping them off, like, yeah, this is, you're not gonna be able to destroy me. Like I'm beyond this. And so that happens, and they defeat the bull. The goddesses are super pissed. He walks, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they walk back to town. Can you guys hear that ambulance? They walking back to town, and what is the first thing that happens? Y'all not gonna believe this. Ishtar, who's the temple prostitute, comes up to Gilgamesh, right? And basically says, lay with me. And so this represents so many different things. We now have the before and after. We now go and we have Ishtar, who's like a big deal, taking the position of a prostitute and is now like subservient to Gilgamesh. It's like, basically what she is saying is like, in this new world where the ego is supreme, I need to find a way to still relate to you. I need a position. And what does Gilgamesh do? Gilgamesh is like, he literally, I think he asks, what happened to your other husbands, right? They were actually all killed by Ishtar. And so he represents the hero, the ego that could push through the unconscious and like make its own place. And so this alludes to a bunch of different things, like that the ego in the conscious mind has repeatedly tried to pierce through the unconscious, and it couldn't. And at each time, the unconscious found a way to relate to it in such a way that it could kind of suppress the conscious mind. But this represents something else. The story of Gilgamesh, the epic of Gilgamesh, represents something else. It is that permanent piercing through of the conscious mind. Bizarre. Okay. Bizarre. It sounds absolutely crazy, but y'all need to think about it. Think about it deeply and get back to me, because it sounds insane, but I'm telling you, if you read the book, you will see the connections and you'll be like, holy crap. Like, you'll never be able to read it again after watching this video and think this is like a weird work of fiction. You'd be like, no, this is not just some fictitious thing. Who would conjure up such a weird story to tell if the story didn't have some kind of significance and some kind of meaning? Okay, I'm getting tired, so I'm going to breeze through the rest of this story, and then we're going to call it good. Okay, because I got a big day tomorrow. I got to get some sleep. All right. So we got Gilgamesh, all this happens, but what happens to Enkidu now that basically Gilgamesh is like ruling the world? He just killed the giant bull from heaven. He is like, nah, Ishtar, I don't need you in my life. Right? He's on top of the world and like hyper masculine, doing his thing. What happens to Enkidu? He gets sick, right? And we should expect this because Gilgamesh is further pushing himself from the nature of Enkidu, from that natural, from that more primitive relationship to the unconscious. He's continually pushing it away. So it makes sense that Enkidu falls ill. And we can even read into his illness, right? He slowly degrades before he dies. Like, he slowly gets worse and worse and worse. And we can read that as almost like a prediction that human nature and the focus on the conscious ego will slowly degrade our relationship to the unconscious, is how somebody like my professor would read that. Bonkers, okay? Insane. Everything's insane. So we have this. What does Gilgamesh do when Enkidu falls sick? He's like, oh shit, I need to save this guy's life. Like, I am realizing now that I done messed up. And he goes on this journey and actually meets Upnatishnu or something. Big, long, crazy Sumerian name. But Upnatishnu, he becomes Noah, as in Noah's Ark, okay? No, we're not going to get in the flood. That'll be a different time. The flood is a whole nother thing. Okay, but he meets him, and he's basically like, I need you to find, because he's immortal. Noah is immortal. I'm just calling him Noah because his name's hard to pronounce. Noah is immortal. He goes to him and he's like, I need your help. I need you to give me something that will save my friend, save Enkidu. And he says, absolutely. Like, I will send you in the right direction. And he goes through a test. Gilgamesh fails the test. Can't get it. He goes to the bottom of the ocean eventually to find this little thing. It's like an herb. And the herb does actually provide immortality. But Gilgamesh, after doing all this stuff, sets the herb down and a snake comes and eats it. That snake will come back time and time again. So remember the snake for a different video, but the snake we will see pop up most famously in the Garden of Eden. Okay. But so we have Gilgamesh. He's like this close to grasping immortality for his friend. And he's not trying to achieve immortality for himself. He is a god, right? This is for preserving his relationship to the unconscious. Once he realizes, like, oh shit, this is actually not a good thing that I'm losing this. And he fails. He comes back and yeah, he basically took like a huge L and couldn't figure out how to keep his friend alive and well. And so one thing I do want to mention before we end this up is that, yeah, what can we see like big picture stuff? We see the development of the conscious mind and its eventual, you could say, conquering of the unconscious mind to ascend to that position where it's at the top, where it's most important. We see the death really of our like primitive relationship to nature in Humbaba. His death and then Enkidu's degradation represents that. And we see that in society today. Like, is there anything? There isn't even anything that's nature anymore. We can't even point toward nature because now nature has been classified as like a cultural concept, right? So even nature isn't nature anymore. We don't even have a concept of nature. And so these things are being hinted at all the way at the beginning, way before we, embark on these mass deforestation things or polluting our water and shit like that. And so, yes, we see that. We see the feminine now and the unconscious in general take a huge step down in priority. It used to be that the unconscious and the feminine was the way that we saw the world. And it was harmonious, it was stable. But it was also, what we would consider like primitive and not very advanced. But now we have the ego, which relates to it in a completely different way. And so, again, I got to zoom out even further. The big things we can take away is that the mythological things, these stories, are not pointing at literal people that exist out there. Not talking about a literal king Gilgamesh. And if you look at it that way, you're not going to get anything out of it, right? You can look at it that way. You can look at it from a political perspective, from a scientific perspective, but you're not going to fully grasp what they're trying to say. And I think for anybody who only looks at it from a scientific perspective, you have to remember that the people writing this are not scientifically minded. They have no idea what science is. They're writing this from a completely different worldview and most likely a different perception of the world. And so we can't be so quick to toss these stories away. These are like the fundamental stories and the fundamental attempts to understand our brain. And so remember, we got a whole bunch of time here. We've been spending it just on Gilgamesh. And the issue is that there are so many iterations of the story and it goes on all the way to modern day. And so I would argue that Christianity is also a iteration of this Gilgamesh story. But that'll be for another time. I know this video was supposed to mainly be about Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. So I will, that'd be a good way to wrap it up. So Carl Jung would look at this story as the way that I've kind of presented it, as having all these different elements of meaning. and that Gilgamesh really represents a fight in our own mind, in our own psyche, between the conscious and the unconscious. And the moral of the story is, how do we mediate between those two things? And how can we use the story to see where we're going and see where we're going to end up? The Freud position, the Freudian view, would be that this meaning doesn't exist in these stories. That these stories are just kind of like primitive iterations of religion, and that religion is what Sigmund Freud considers as wish fulfillment, infantile wish fulfillment. And this is where, for me personally, I see value in both of the views. In what I think my professor disagrees with me, but I think that Sigmund Freud's perspective is right in a way, and Carl Jung's his perspective is also right in a way. And so my theory is that there was, when we talked about the whole like more biological part of losing estrus and stuff like that, I think there's a selection towards infantile traits. And so as adult humans, we're like big babies, and then we're more infantile. And with that, with those infantile traits, a huge one is going to be the image of the mother. And our image of our mother assumes a position of God in religion that ultimately becomes masculine for different reasons. And that's Freud's view. And I agree with him on that for sure. I think there's biological, like good scientific data to even support that position. But Carl Jung comes through and he's like, there's more to this unconscious, right? There's more to this religion than just that. Like the judgmental God, let's say, of the Christian religion, and just Abrahamic religions, because they have such a huge emphasis on the masculine judgmental God, represents another part of our conscious mind that we interact with on a daily basis, the voice inside of our head that's constantly demanding more from us. Like, you should do this. You should do this. Right? That literally is the God of the Abrahamic Bible, like looking down at you and being like, you should behave in a certain way. Okay, I'm getting off. I'm going too far. I'm going too deep into all this shit. But yeah, we have Sigmund Freud kind of, I think he is correct. Okay, in a way, I think he's correct in his interpretation, in that religion is very, very related to infancy. I think he's got something. But I also agree with Carl Jung that we can read in these stories and learn more about the dynamics of our psyche, and that it's not just completely infant mother relations, that there's more, that it gets more complex. But we see this infant mother thing pop up everywhere. Think the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, right? We have that kind of imagery. But see, Sigmund Freud would disagree with even using the imagery. So, okay. That's all I've got for today. I need to go to sleep. I get up early tomorrow. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in the stream. Hope you learned something today. And I hope, honestly, that if you're an atheist, or if you're agnostic, or if you're a Christian, that you have like a little, at least consider a different perspective of religion and mythology in general, that it doesn't have to be put in this modern day box where like we have to test this scientifically, because the people who wrote this were not testing it scientifically. That wasn't the purpose of the text. And we'll get more into the Bible specifically, because I think that is just such a fascinating turnaround for human history. And we'll see how the masculine and the feminine really like destroyed the story of Christianity, in my opinion. Okay, that's all. Thank you again for watching, and hopefully I can get like a real, like a edited video out this week or this weekend. I'm not sure, but eventually I will be posting this content. There's so much content in my course that I want to be able to like get it out to the world, so y'all don't gotta pay for it like I do, but so I can get it out to the world and then go through it and like, turn it into some videos with visuals and stuff. So I will get to there. So there's more stuff. If you feel like you didn't get a lot, there's more coming. Okay. Thank you, whoever these 2 people are that are still in here. Y'all are loyal subscribers, and I respect it. All right. Good night, y'all.